Okay, so I'd like to call the meeting, CCSU meeting to order at 6:39. Welcome everyone. Our first item on the agenda is visitors and employees to be heard. Seeing none, I would like to instead extend an invitation to not an invitation, I'm sorry, a welcome to Scott Coolidge. We had a reorganization in Westford, and thank you very much to Andre Roy for his service on the CCSU board, and now we welcome Scott, who is taking his place for this term. So thank you, Scott, welcome.
Thank you.
Our next item, agenda 3, is our task team updates. So we have a little bit to talk about from every task team today. Starting us off will be Michael in communications.
Okay, for communications, we're still continuing to work on new board member orientation. Another current significant piece of communications is budget communications, especially for E46 and potential committee. And then the third thing, which is also in your boards notes and has kind of been passed out by either your board chairs or from Ben, is that communications, board communications is going to be going through the CCSU website now. So through your email, through your org notes will be available on the CCSU site, no longer emailed to you. Any questions?
Working out well for me so far.
I know, I'm still getting used to it, to be honest. It's just another piece that's not quite in my...
Get onto the site.
Okay, so everybody except Martha?
Well, I've got to talk to Vince because for some reason
Right.
I have trouble printing my reports. Where if I print from work or if I printed from my home email, never had it this last time. I can't tell you how much trouble. It didn't want to seem to pull the amount, so I got to talk to Vince.
Okay.
So, or I might have to start having hard copies mailed to me or something.
I'm sure we can work that out.
Yeah. We've gotten here from Ben.
Anything else, Michael?
Nope, that was all I had.
All right, next committee report, leaders at work. Jack?
Thank you, Mark. You'll see in your org notes, I think it's attachment 5 and 6. I just want to double check that. The yes, 5 and 6, the superintendent evaluation timeline and the superintendent evaluation timeline graphic. These have been the focus of attention in leaders at work. We're in the process now of kind of doing. It's a parallel track that's happening. We've discussed this in previous CCSU board meetings. We're in the process now of coming up with the annual work plan and the goals for the upcoming school year, the 2014-15, as well as wrapping up the evaluation process for the superintendent for this year that's based on her entry plan, Superintendent DeNova's entry plan, and the what would I want to call them, the job description identifications that have been established. And as has previously been reported out, we've had a formative assessment with the superintendent. We did that back in January, and we'll use that going forward for our summative assessment, which would occur after this particular period of performance is over, which is the 30th of June of this year. So again, take a look at, I call your attention to items 5 and item 6, which is the superintendent evaluation timeline. The new news one here is attachment 6, which kind of may make things a little bit easier because you can see things by fiscal year, how fiscal years overlap, what's going on from developing the AYP, when you do a formative assessment, when you do a summative assessment, and how things kind of line up one on top of the other. And the other thing I just want to bring to this board's attention about superintendent's evaluation was from the Burlington Free Press of last Monday, the 17th of March, And I would encourage every board member here, if you haven't read the article already, about what the Burlington School Board did or more likely did not do in terms of evaluating the superintendent. And it's an interesting, informative article. We want to be in a position to hold up our responsibilities as a board and make sure we're giving a fair and accurate evaluation to our superintendents. So use that as, if you can, look at that article. I have a hard copy of it here, but I know it's available online as well. So thank you.
Questions? Paul, just in time, can you give us a update from the policy task team?
Sure, we actually met last Wednesday for a meeting on student policies. We're currently reviewing the J section, which involves all student policies, and the meeting prior to that, we're also reviewing a policy called B20, which was board staff communications. We finalized that and sent it forward for first reading tonight, as well as a couple other student-centered policies, one dealing with student health policy and overarching student health policy, which by incorporating, I think there's probably 5 policies that we're incorporating into one overarching student health policy, and that would subsequently mean the removal of really what were tantamount to procedural policies that had been on the books for a long time and been really in need of updating and becoming more in line with the standards of practice that the Vermont Agency of Education has published. So it's really kind of a cleaning up of student policies and an editing of one of the board communication policies.
Okay. Questions? Okay, Judy will give us an update on the negotiations task team.
So the small group negotiations team met last Wednesday, and I think we have approximately 4 articles left for us to have tentative agreements per article. It's been a very worthwhile structure for negotiations. I think both parties have appreciated having the time to look at the language and the organization of the master agreement, and to ask questions about what some of the language has meant in the past and why it's changed. I think that we have one more small group negotiation set for 2 weeks from now.
April 3rd.
Yeah, and I think that should be our last, I'm hoping it's the last need for the small groups negotiation, and then we have on April 16th, I think, the full group negotiations, 16th with the board council. So you'll really be down to negotiating the duration and terms of salary and those aspects, the financial components. So it's been very worthwhile. Paul's joined me with Deb Robbins and Chris during the process, and if there's anything else you want to share as a longtime negotiator as far as the process has been concerned. But
Very collegial. I think it's been a good opportunity, like you said, to really discuss some of the provisions that have not really been analyzed traditionally in our traditional negotiations. I think it's really just getting into some of the existing language that really just trying to figure out what the origins were and if they were getting rid of some of the archaic language that hasn't really been touched. And I think it's helpful to have both sides have a really meaningful conversation about some of those provisions that we typically haven't looked at.
So good progress.
Thanks. Questions?
Just one question from probably it goes along with the legislative update, that bill that's talking about less districts. Will this contract flow into that if we do have to become one district with Westford,
I think
the
that
high school, and PC?
I think it's a great first step in that should we expand our district? At least you'll converge one agreement versus three distinctly different agreements into whomever you're expanding with. So it has some benefits and
But the salary schedules may still be different.
maybe.
So it's the language sections,
language.
which I think will be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And even without governance change, just administering the agreement will be so much easier if the people in human resources don't have to stop and think, oh, which agreement do I have to look for the question this person is asking?
Right.
It'll be one answer, except for probably just salary. Will
Yeah.
probably still be different for a little while.
Yeah, until it shifts. So it's more the closer you're aligned, the easier it is to move forward and to administer.
The timeline for any legislative action is going to be 5 years or so before implementation. So any agreement we have in place now most likely will not have a term of 5 years or more. Any other questions? All right.
I'm trying to think how I want to phrase this. We're making great progress in these consolidated contract talks. But the contract expires on the 30th of June, and today's the 24th of March, right? So are we in a position, what's our outlook? Are we going to continue these contract talks if we go beyond if it goes beyond the 30th of June, or will we be in a position where we have to do an alternative path? I don't know. I fear we're making progress, but I know we have a deadline, and I don't know where we are in terms of our progress versus the end of the current contract.
Mm-hmm. We are very cognizant of the time that our current contract expires. We've been working towards reaching agreement before the 30th. I think it'll depend on where we find ourselves. I don't anticipate more than one additional to the one that's already scheduled, small group. I think our small group work will be completed in one more session. Then the Board Negotiations Council work will be pretty focused on the final 3 articles, and pending any unexpected outcomes of those areas, I would hope that we would be in agreement. If we are not in agreement, then we would roll forward with the language of the current contract.
Okay. Thank you.
And go through all the steps described in law about impasse and all of the, and mediation and fact finding.
Correct.
But hopefully,
Well, it's been on a, it seems like a fairly good path thus far, so hopefully we will be able to wrap it up in a good way.
And considering the complexity of a unified agreement, to have that managed during the course of one bargaining season will be quite an accomplishment. And so it's our goal to be there.
Okay. Further questions? All right, the last committee report out is from the executive committee. So our the result of our last group of meetings is that we have a executed superintendent contract. So that's true as of Friday.
Yes.
Yeah. So the contract is for a term of 2 years. And after a good discussion with Chris Leopold, we talked about some of the terms that the CCSU board and some of the local boards have brought up in the past, specifically around the end date, or the notification date for non-renewal. And we've determined that moving that up would be in our best interests. So right now it's at the end of March in previous contracts, and it's been moved to early February. And that kind of puts us in the middle of where most of the other districts in the area are at. So it gives us a little bit more flexibility, not necessarily to still be able to conduct a full superintendent search in the time remaining, but definitely gives us more opportunity to react, especially if you consider that that seems to be a rather busy time with budgeting anyway, and meetings. Other changes of note include a change to the number of personal days. Judy's request, it will go down from 10 to 5. And you can speak to that if you wish.
I just think in good faith bargaining that I'd like to, through the superintendent's contract model, the need for personal days as far as being true to the need for personal time. I think in many ways it's a structure that came into play during a time when you couldn't get to a bank. Banks would close and there wasn't any way to do your banking, and some of those other moments in time that weren't quite as easily accessed as they are in today's world. And as we change and look at leaves as we're negotiating them with teachers, I wanted to model something that was more realistic and more in line with teachers' contracts. I hope to lead through example by that reduction.
Okay. Otherwise, we also did take into consideration some recommendations from Chris Leopold around language that's common in other districts and most superintendent contracts in the state. One clause specifically was that if for not for a reason of underperformance, but just perhaps fit, a superintendent isn't working out, then you could buy the remainder of their contract out. That is something that is very common elsewhere. We added it in at his recommendation, more as a protection for both sides. But otherwise, rather standard. And if you recall our discussions last year around salary, we began at the midpoint, and this year reflects midpoint plus 1 year of experience. So again, very much in line with the expectation of both sides. Thank you, Judy, for your help and flexibility there.
Yeah.
It worked well, and we're very happy to have you on board.
Thank you. And I haven't had a chance to thank you all for the appointment. I'm really excited about leading the district forward through the remainder of this year and years to come, and appreciate the opportunity that you've all, and your faith in me to do that. So my plan is to continue to make you very proud of CCSU, because there's lots to be proud of, and to continue working collaboratively to make our goals, to reach our goals that we've identified. So thank you all. Deeply appreciate. Thank you. Yeah.
Contract is officially signed.
Yes, Marla.
So now I can be nasty. That's it. She's on.
Let it fly.
Huh?
Let it fly.
That's right.
It is the culmination of a year's worth of hard work on many people's parts. So
It surely was.
I know that Brian and the SAC aren't here, but again, thank you to everybody who made that possible. So a lot of trust was involved to get to this point. The community around us spoke, so thank you. Questions on that?
Speaking of that, are we going to send an official thank you to Brian Regan? How does that work? I think just the meetings I saw him at very professional, and I just didn't know if there's a formal thank you that goes out.
Well, informally, I know that the members of the executive committee have thanked him, but I'm more than happy to put something together on behalf of the CCSU board.
And I don't know if the committee that worked for us deserves thank you. That's a lot of work, a lot of stress.
Absolutely.
I just
Absolutely.
think it would be nice.
Okay, so another executive committee update. We have been looking at the concept of pulling together the AYP goals, and this kind of leads into one of our next agenda topics, and understanding on how to incorporate the board goals that we had discussed here and are reflected in the minutes into a meaningful AYP, AWP.
Right.
Sorry. So annual work plan for the superintendent. And then obviously the good work that's been happening at Leaders at Work, now continue that connection onward. That's agenda item number 6, but we will have discussion around the AWP goals, and I hope it to be a little more focused, because I think we've identified that it does have to be very much aligned with the superintendent's perspectives as well, and that give or take is important, because many of the things we ask for may have some preconditions that we are not aware of that need to be established prior to a larger goal maybe being executed. So moving on, agenda item number 4, legislative update. Before I hand it over to Martha, we did have a very good representation at the regional VSBA meeting that took place a week and change ago at MMU. So that was the first of the VSBA regional meetings centered on just talking and gathering information about some of the proposed governance changes that are being discussed in Montpelier. And the facilitation was really geared more towards just capturing people's concerns. It wasn't a hearing, and they were very clear to bring that out. But it was surprising to understand how many different perspectives were coming out during that meeting. Some were a bit protectionist. You know, this is what we know. This is what works for us. We're not sure we're ready for change. But then the very opposite end of the spectrum was, it takes a great deal of leadership and courage to go against tradition and do what's right for students. And what was held up as a great example was the unified high school push that occurred in the 60s, I guess. Mm-hmm. And as we were sitting in MMU and having all of these member districts telling us what it took to make MMU happen, kind of brought that into focus. But there's clearly a lot that could affect us. You have included in your packet some of the language and the potential timelines for that legislation. I'd be more than happy to entertain questions on it, but first I'll let Martha discuss a bit about what's happening under the covers.
So the House Education Committee passed out their version of the bill on Friday on a 10-0-1 vote, which means one person was absent. It will go to Ways and Means now, because there's the proposal in there to change the taxing district, if you will. You'd be combining the tax bases, if you will, of multiple towns, like we do now with union high schools, to determine tax rates. And then it will come to my committee because there are appropriations in the bill. I was told that Ways and Means would probably have it for 2 weeks. I think there will be an effort during those 2 weeks to gather members in small groups to talk about the legislation. It isn't clear to me whether it's going to make it out of the House this session, and it's not clear to me if it did make it out of the House, whether it would even have time for the consideration that it needs in the Senate. So personally, I'd be surprised if it made it all the way through this year, but I could be wrong. I read the legislation this weekend, and I will just share that my personal struggle is that the legislation says a lot of the right things about opportunities for kids and 21st century learning. I don't yet understand how this structure makes that more possible. And so that's certainly one of the questions I'll be asking. I'm also very concerned that they skirted the issues that we came up against when we tried to do this ourselves. And one of them is representation on the board. I don't think there's any way around the constitutional requirement of one person, one vote. You know, that's what we found when we did our study. So I'm a little frustrated. If you read the legislation, you'll see they put that off to a research group or something. And, you know, I don't think you can get around it. Look how hard we try to figure out something different. And the best we could do was 4 and 2 people from Westford, each with a half a vote. You know, that's the best we could do. So, and the other big issue that they skirted is choice, mostly high school choice. And, you know, they try to say in the bill, well, it can be decided whether, you know, some towns, kids from some towns can retain choice, or choice should be offered to all students. Well, what we found out when we did our study was, again, it's a constitutional issue. You couldn't allow, let's say it was a union of Essex Junction and Westford. You can't allow Westford students to choose where they go to high school without letting all of Essex Junction, Essex Town, and Westford students to decide where they go to high school. So I think they didn't take on 2 of the thorniest issues in the bill. So you should each read it for yourselves. If you have specific questions and you want to email me, you know, I'd be glad to try to answer them. The other big thing that's going on in the education arena is the property tax bill, and it will reduce the proposed increase from 7 cents to 4 cents. It will keep the base rate at the recommended amount. It's not coming up for a vote till tomorrow in Ways and Means, but I think most of it's pretty clear at this point. It will increase the non-residential rate by the 7 cents plus 1 more. So they're trying to equalize the non-residential and residential rate impacts. Then they're doing, this probably is too complex for right now, but they're increasing the base income rate from 1.8 to 1.9, which is more than the recommendation, in order to spread out the slope. So if you remember, over $90,000, people can still get some income sensitivity, but it's related to the value of your property. And before, it only went up to $200,000 of property value. This will extend it to 250, and I've forgotten, but I think that means that people up into the high 90s, maybe as much as 100,000 of household income, may be able to get some income sensitivity. They're capping the total amount of credit or income sensitivity you can get at $6,000 instead of $8,000, except if you're over 65. At least that's the proposal that's on the table. Then they have some proposals. Oh, and they're reducing renter rebate from 21% to 19%. And that's based on research around what portion of a renter's rent is attributable to property taxes. And that's one of the changes that allows them to get to 3 cents. Then they're proposing some things for the future. One is to phase out the small schools grant over time. One is to continue to look at a change to a system that relies more on income and less on property value. There's one piece in there that I've been trying to work on but haven't had much time, and that is a change in the hold harmless provision for her decreasing student enrollment from 3.5% to 5%, which would be pretty harmful to Westford. And so and this is proving incredibly challenging, I'm trying to say, if a district has been responsible and has decreased staffing as student enrollment has declined, then they should be able to stay at 3.5%. And I don't know that that's how it's going to work out, but I'm trying to work out something in that regard that could mean that it's not harmful to districts like Westford, and at the same time provides an incentive for districts that haven't changed their staffing to do so. And it's a time problem, not just for me, but for the head council, for the people who work for the department. So if I'm not successful on the House side of working something out, I'll continue to work on it in the Senate. One of the things you can do now is that every single committee has a website. If you go to www.leg.state, spell out the word, .vt.us, then you can go to the committee's piece and you'll be able to figure out how to get to the web page. So it will have various drafts of bills. It will have proposals that the committee's working on. I know the education side has a lot of the communication that the committee receives. So if there's something you really want to follow, it's much more transparent than it used to be. So I think I'll stop there, yeah.
Quick question on, so to achieve the change in the tax rate, is there a one-time money component as well? Because it sounds like many of the things you described have legs and could make a difference.
So things
next
like
year.
The renter rebate change and the capping the total credit, those all free up money toward reducing the rate. The fact that school budgets, and they aren't all in yet, as you know, but for the districts that reported, they came in about $8.7 million lower than the department in total, lower than the department had projected. They were able to add a little money out of the stabilization reserve and buy a penny right there. Each penny is about $10 million. Takes about $10 million. So, but they do spend $6 million out of a supplemental property tax reserve fund, relief special fund, and that's one-time money. So that will present a challenge next year.
Other questions?
It's not a question, but I did ask Grant to send to you electronically what this means if that legislation that Martha was talking about happens, as far as the reduction from $1.01 to 98 cents and the impact for each school. So you've received that, and where we find ourselves, communications will need to update, and it'll have implications for annual meeting as far as being able to explain what these changes will mean.
But it's still protected. It still has to pass the House. It clearly
Absolutely.
will pass the House, but it still has to go through the Senate. And so,
That's why we didn't change any of our publications. We're still staying in line with what's
Yeah.
been predicted and projected, and we'll make those changes, so at least you can see what's anticipated and its impact.
Right, well, that's some good news.
some.
All right, any other questions? All right, thank you very much, Martha.
Mhm.
So you see, our next agenda item has been marked for action required. Policies first reading. So our policy committee has been very busy at work, and
I keep trying to.
as you can tell by the inclusions in our org notes, and thank you very much for having the introductions about the revisions
Yes.
for each of these pieces. It made it a lot easier to understand the intent.
Is there a way to?
But there's quite a few policies here, so I'll step back and let
Scrolling.
Paul guide us through the policies that we have up for first reading and then the follow-on vote needed.
I mean, it's doing it slow.
But first of all, I guess
It's
I'll start working through them, and I guess, do you want to save questions, or do you have any questions that you want to address before we start moving through the first readings and removals, or is it, do you want to save questions for each specific policy as we move forward?
Any overarching questions around the procedures used?
Oh, no.
No? If you want to go policy by policy, I think that might be most expeditious.
Okay. I think we can start off first with the board staff communications policy. That's B20. That's as you can see from the cover sheet, that's been a policy that's been recommended by the school climate committee last year for to be reviewed and to find out if there are any obstacles that could be identified to inhibiting any school communications between board and staff members. The policy subcommittee has reviewed it, has made a few suggestions to it, chief being the identification and definitions of official and unofficial communications that have not previously been in the policy. The edits of the committee are also attempting to maintain the openness of the communication and the spirit of the communication policy to keep that type of channels open between board and staff, identifying that staff members are welcome to talk with the board members. There are appropriate times to make those conversations, and then there are also recognition of appropriate channels for official communications such as labor relations, personnel complaints, certain things that are delineated by policy, and also to recognize that those types of official communications need to move through a official or an identified chain of communication. The edits, while providing the definitions, also the one main change was from the committee's perspective, was necessary that there should be in the policy edit was to ensure that there was at least one other outlet for communication from the staff to the board. Previously, all communications went through the superintendent. The committee made the recommendation that communication could go also to the board chair in some circumstances. So that's the main issue, the main edit that I would point out prior to first reading. And that's been identified in the cover sheet. If you're moving and looking at the B20, the underlined portions that I spoke to earlier is the definitions on the top, and also the and/or board chair piece towards the bottom. It's under official communications on the second page. That's the other main edit.
So questions on this, Martha?
So I was curious as to whether the committee looked at VSBA, I think they have a recommended policy kind of handbook. Did the policy committee look at what was under board staff communications?
We did. Board staff communications is not a required policy
Right.
in the VSBA, but they do have
understand.
guidance. It's rather generic. This policy had been in existence for years. It was last edited in 2008 by the policy subcommittee. We did look at a variety of samples and VSBA guidance. Certainly there's a couple people from the policy subcommittee that can speak to how many changes we looked at and what edits we thought were appropriate.
So I have a few concerns. First of all, I wondered why you took out the social interaction section. I think some of the language in there is an important reminder to board members that in social situations they have to be very cognizant of the fact that they're not speaking for the board. So why was that removed?
I think our goal when writing this policy was really to sort of narrow the focus of it to official communication and what can and can't be done in official communication, and sort of not get into trying to describe what might happen in non-official communication in social situations, or it's really trying to sort of focus on what is not allowed through official communication. But that's just my perspective. I don't know. Like,
But you do have a non-official communications section, and maybe it's enough that we sign a code of ethics, but that was one of my concerns. A second concern was that staff communications could be submitted through the board chair. I think, what if it's a grievance? Things that the board is gonna have to act on? I don't think the communication should, especially communications about issues like that, should come through the board chair. Did you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, we did. I think a lot of what you bring up is around sort of training the board staff. I have faith that our chairs would know that they needed to inform the superintendent in that situation. But I mean, I think your point's well taken. We talked about it. That's probably the biggest area of discussion. The board chair and superintendent, and so we talked a lot about it. I think similar concerns were raised by the administration. I think, yeah. I mean, I don't feel strongly about it one way or the other. I'm not.
So, can you think? I mean, I just think it could compromise the board. So unless you were going to say, in this very narrow kind of situation, the communication could go through the board chair, and I can't imagine what that would be, I feel really uncomfortable with those words in there.
So, looking at the definition of official communication, right? Personnel issues, collective bargaining, labor grievances, interpretation of district policy, and employment directives. So those very much speak to the partnership between the superintendent and administration and the school boards, because many of these items require a great deal of collaboration through every step. Personnel issues could come to us, and do often. Employment directives, I think that almost crosses a line where the board is not meant to run the school, but to establish policy. So I'm curious, when I looked at this, my thought was almost, I expected it to be superintendent and board chair being the option, because that ensures that both parties, both trees of the organization are informed, but it leaves the authority to act on that in the right place. Right now we seem to have a strong enough relationship where I feel there's nothing that, as a school board chair for Westford, I don't know about that needs to be communicated. But by adding "and," that's a bit of insurance for staff, because they don't necessarily know. They're not part of this organization. They're not part of these meetings. The "or" part, though, puts the onus on a board chair then to inform the superintendent, which this isn't a board chair's full-time job. This is not their paid position. They're not evaluated. So, there can be cases where something could slip through the cracks, and it could be a grievance or a personnel issue or something where there's very real repercussions for people. So I understand where you're getting at and what you're getting at, but I think I'd like to go hand in hand rather than separate the two sides of ownership of any issue.
But But I just wonder if there aren't situations where the board chair shouldn't see the communication because the board is going to be the judicial body that makes the decision. And so the board chair shouldn't be seeing just one piece of it ahead of time. So that concerns me a lot.
I think that goes back to the definition of official communication again.
Yeah.
Right? If it is a personnel issue, would we be expecting to say there is a grievance being filed, period, or would we expect to see the story as it unfolds? Right? My expectation.
Well,
would be
this says the staff can send anything about any of these issues to a board chair. That's what this says.
It's official communications intended for the board or board committees from the staff may be submitted to the superintendent and or the board chair. So I guess I'm wondering, is a filing of a grievance a communication to the board, or is it a communication to the district, or is it a communication to administration? Who's it communicating to?
Grievances are outlined in the master agreement. They start at step 1, which would be the lowest step, so it would be with the supervisor and most of the circumstances a director or a principal. The next step would be the superintendent. The next step would be the board, and then after that, if it's not resolved at the board level, it would go to an arbitrator.
Yeah. I mean, so what has had this policy floating around for a while is part of this is to try to have access for dissent, for information to be able to freely flow to the board of a nature that may not necessarily be of the direction that we're heading. I think that has been trying to find that balance without it necessarily, without it just being a screen door as well. But if the committee is looking to try to assess, if we have a committee or a task force, or the board is looking to at any time try to sort of assess the climate of the organization, it might be looking for free and direct flow of information from the staff.
Well, isn't...
And again, recognize your policy committee brought this back to you with no changes once already last year. I mean, we assessed it and we made no changes to it, and then this is at least our third look at it to try to, after every board was consulted on what is the outcomes we want to see with B20. I know that U46 had that discussion. We provided no guidance. I believe U46 said the current policy is fine. So there was another board that felt like we needed an outcome. So it would be curious, does this revision look like that outcome that the board was looking for?
Marla?
I believe when we spoke as a PC board, our concern was official versus unofficial. I don't remember us being this exact as to saying official communications would go to the superintendent and / or board chair. Because I agree with Martha, I see it as a problem for grievances to have it puts the board chair in an awkward position. And I do know from being in grievances before, usually the board chairs are in consultation with the superintendent in advance, and there's things they know that the rest of us can't know because we are the jury. So my concern with this is official communications is isolated to personnel issues, collective bargaining, labor grievances, interpretation of district policy, and employment directives. To me, those official communications should not be going to the board chair. It should go to the superintendent. That's how I feel, because we've got to protect the grievance, and unless you want to state something in there that, that can happen, or otherwise we follow, there could be a clause in there that we follow the master agreement for grievances. I mean, if you wanna.
But that's not gonna cover some of the other things.
Right. I know what the climate committee and what everybody was trying to open it up. I think separating non-official versus official, to me, satisfies, because people always question, what's this, how can we talk to the staff? Can staff talk to board members? I think this lays it out that we can, and the conditions, but I think when you get to the official communications, I really don't think it can go to the board chair also.
So, Brian, you made a very important point that I want to repeat, and that is, and I think it almost bridges on unofficial communication, but if there's a direction or whatever that we're taking, that somebody under the superintendent's chain of command disagrees with, how can that communication occur with the board? And if you have to tell your superior that you don't agree with them, and can you please let your boss know for me, I can see where that's a stumbling block. How do we elicit some honest feedback about things that maybe the board does need to know from staff? And that's where we saw the communications committee work very positively, but that could be very tricky, because many times that assumes that there's disagreement, and if it's disagreement, does that affect an individual's performance review? I'm struggling with, I see the value there, but I'm struggling with understanding how we can do it without compromising something in that very delicate balance where they still are responsible to the superintendent to execute on those directives. Martha?
So that brings me to, why do we cross out board meetings with staff? It seems to me that language was the perfect opportunity for, to make it clear that boards can meet with staff from time to time and exchange ideas with them. And, that ought to be the forum, I think, for hearing, what's on staff's mind.
That strikes me as a board-initiated action, which I don't think is the idea. I think the idea is a staff-initiated action. And if a staff member would like to invite the board to a meeting, that communication has to go through the superintendent. And so I think that's where the tension is. So I think that's what, I don't know, I think that's what Mark's sort of getting at. That flow of information from staff to a board, as opposed to us going to a committee of staff and saying, listen, this topic's of interest to us, give us your feedback on it.
So staff initiated, and I'll call it a staff initiated concerns, exchange of concerns, right? Perhaps positive, negative, but not bridging on any of these particular topics. That's a very narrow window.
And I think it's delicate too. I think it's.
And I mean, you don't want a single staff member with a gripe to be able to involve the whole board, and yet, if there's something of a nature that is creating widespread dissatisfaction, I don't have an answer off the top of my head. So I hear what you're saying, and I think there is something there. I just can't. I wonder if we can, send it back, I'm sorry, and just ask that you talk to the SBA or, or superintendents or legal counsel in other districts, or, has anyone come up with a way to handle that situation?
And recognize too, we heard from the educational leadership team, they're also looking to preserve the same protection on the opposite flow as well. So that you have a single board member that has a lot of opinions and has a lot of ideas or a lot of information needs, and has this direct flow into the school and is showing up to find out more information and do their own research. So they're also looking for the sense of we want to find the right balance where it's constructive and productive and that it serves the whole. But in all these situations, when it's serving just the individual, we've built a system that I'm not sure is highly effective.
I agree. Yeah.
Can I?
Marla?
It's been around for so long, though. I would really like to have an idea from this board before it goes back anywhere, or should it go back there and we decide, we make the decision, because it's been going back and forth. And I almost think it's at the point where it's been given to us and we have to decide. And honestly, I'm okay with the official, unofficial, the first page.
Well, I like that part of it.
I like that part. The part I don't like is, I think and/or the board chair should be struck out.
Mm-hmm.
If Mark, Jack, and Mike agree, that's the direction I think we should go.
So,
And then where we've got board meetings with staff, I would think there would be a way that we could write this, that if a committee, a staff committee, or concerns of staff would like to meet with the board, it can be done unofficially, or concerns. There could be a way that that's written in there, so that they know they could bring something to us.
So bring back that section about the board being able to meet with staff, but and I don't think we're going to do it sitting here, and that's why I think it might as well go back to the committee. Some way for a group of staff members who don't feel a particular concern is being addressed. I don't know.
I'm going to be very honest. There's a couple PC members on the policy committee, and I know that they don't agree with this. We're going to send it back to policy. It's going to be an argument. It's going to just go around and revolve. I think if we're going to send it back anywhere, that it's got to be a group of us that get together with Judy or Paul and come up with what the intent is, because we know what it takes and what our chairs are all sitting here. I don't think they want.
so
This has been the most informative conversation that's been provided to the policy subcommittee to date about this policy.
Interesting.
Everything else has been either through some type of guise or some type of unspoken, or we really need to look at this, it's this kind of issue. I think this is, Martha, your point of the code of ethics sounds like a great idea to reference that in some part of this, is that we should be aware that we're all signing a code of ethics, and in that have it. Board meeting with staff is a terrible title. It's one of the reasons why it was crossed out, because it's all about individuals wanting to get inside the school and have meetings with people. It's not about the board holding a meeting with the staff. But that concept is kind of interesting to play around with at the policy subcommittee is, well, what if we had board meetings? Could staff request them? Could they request a meeting with the board? How do we go about that? Our policy is completely silent on
It can't be
that.
an individual staff member.
Right, it
So
would, and it wouldn't be an
then,
individual board member, but it would
Right.
work within our structure that we want to do, and that is more of the inform all to support all. So I think that just this small conversation has been more helpful than what we've received to date for the policy subcommittee.
So, Ryan's point of
Unless you've
who
always-
initiates the communication need, I think, is very valuable to apply to that concept. We can, as board members, offer opportunities by setting up times where we could be there, but we don't offer that same, we don't offer a reciprocal agreement where a group of staff members could request our presence. If that's really the goal of finding that slightly formal, informal time where we are identifying this need to the superintendent, we may have representation from administration, but it can be initiated from both directions. Does that satisfy this need? Because I feel it only comes up when we don't want it to be a grievance. We don't want it to be an issue. We want to be able to address it when it's small and easy to talk about.
Yeah.
So, is there really a need to do that, and do we satisfy that need by just allowing the communication request to be two-way?
I think then you need to think about your role of the principal or supervisor.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to think about.
And I think this convolutes roles and responsibilities as it's currently written. I think that even for myself, I stop often because some of the communications come from a place of people being in a highly emotionally charged place, be they parents, teachers, whatever the circumstance may be. So during those times, sometimes that call comes directly to the superintendent when I say, have you talked to your principal yet? And then there's all the reasons why they haven't talked to the principal yet. And that's the person who is the most intimate with the child or the teacher or the circumstance. And we can't let our system jump over the place where the person who has the authority to remedy the situation isn't in that loop. I just think that's such a critical part. And oftentimes I have to just always remind myself, wait a minute, this has to go back still. It's not that I don't want to hear you or talk to you about your concern. I just know that your principal really is a person. And sometimes the principal will say, it's your teacher. Let's make sure we have an appointment with you and your teacher. So, I just think it's a hierarchical organization, and those communication pathways are important as far as clarity of roles, responsibilities, and expectations. Because if I call you and tell you as a board chair, then I have an expectation that you're going to take some action. And I think it puts the board chair in a difficult place too.
So I think the system works really well when you have competent principals
Absolutely.
and superintendents, obviously. But I do wonder about the situation where there's great unrest among the faculty over the direction that the district is taking. So I'm not talking about any specific, action that has happened to an individual or an individual grade. But, and I think the U46 board had this situation a couple of years ago, I don't know when. what's the appropriate place for those concerns to be vocalized if, and I'm talking about a group of faculty and staff, don't feel that their efforts to talk to the principal or the superintendent, well, then they can just come to the board. They can already under present policy. I don't know.
If I could just speak to that one piece that you made, I think we experienced it again this year when there was concern that came forward again through an unofficial climate survey. And what was helpful in that situation was reaching back in and saying, let's have a meeting. I can see by these results that there's something that we really need to hear. And so let's sit with the association, let's sit with the principal and the superintendent. Let's come up and plan with how do we make this, how do we hear this and take whatever corrective action or reach whatever resolution is necessary. That was a really healthy meeting. And I think that from that came a task force within the school, and the responsibility for resolving the issue went back to the faculty and administration, and that's where that issue needs to be resolved. And that's the way it's the best way for it to get resolved. So I think that as long as we continue to establish open communication where we acknowledge when there's dissent, bring it to this place where those people who are closest to it have a way to talk and work together through it. And then if that isn't successful, then I would hope as a superintendent you would come forward to your board to look for help and assistance with it.
I saw Ryan's hand first, then Marla.
But at the same time, that's almost an argument to me why you can have a board chair receive those communications. I mean, we all receive those communications.
Mm-hmm.
And the sky didn't fall. We went back to you.
Right.
And well, I don't know about every one of our U46 board members, and it was dealt with appropriately. But I, as a board member, I'm comforted to have the information. I think the goal of the policy is to rewrite the policy in a way that provides an atmosphere of openness to the communication in our district. I don't believe that at least the perception of that was the case with the old policy. I don't believe if we kept the old policy as it was, that perception would change at all based on a new superintendent, new staff in central office. I think that perception would persist into the future. And so, at least in my opinion, our job in attacking B20 was to provide a policy that made it clear to all staff and all board members that we're open to communication. Personally, as a board member, I want as much information as I can possibly get. I'm not afraid of information, and I trust in my training by the leaders at work and in Judy to deal with situations appropriately. And so I think that's what the policy is really getting at and the intent of it. And I just think that for parents, there's recourse. If their principal doesn't do something about anything, they don't have to live by our policies or our communication structure. They can go to the superintendent, or if their teacher's not responding to them, they can go to the principal, and our staff don't have that opportunity right now.
They don't?
Well, it stops. There's an endpoint. A parent can come to the board, and right now, that endpoint is the superintendent. There's no recourse there. They have to abide by our policy. Really? I mean, they don't always.
Where
But
does it say they can't bring something to the board?
all official communication goes through the superintendent. Well, all communication goes through the superintendent now to the board by policy.
Right, around grievances and all.
No,
that.
in the new policy, yes, but in our current policy,
Right,
that it's not official communication. It's not defined in any way. It's just
right.
through the
I
superintendent.
guess I'd have to go back, but do staff have the ability to bring something to the board if they're not happy with the answer? In some cases, they can't. You know, in some cases, we say specifically that the superintendent's decision is final.
Mm-hmm.
But are there cases where they can bring something to the board?
So our complaints policy,
Well, sure, there's
Doesn't it apply to staff or not?
the complaints policy, no, well, there's a grievance policy, the complaints
Well, that's
policy
different.
is more
It's
suited for
staff,
public.
it's for parents.
Well,
What Judy said sounds wonderful, but we may not always have you as a superintendent. We may not always have principals that are receptive to staff and work the process. So I think the object of this was we got to a point where staff members felt that they had to break policy to get to us. So then we do the climate study. There's nothing in policy saying that we're always going to have a climate study in effect. If we always had a climate study survey and it was mandated that it's yearly, then we would get to some of these things. But without having that, then I feel we do have to do something with the policy and resolve this. Be-
Yeah, when you're speaking, I was thinking of just the times when we've gone to try to get the policy to be sort of everything for us. Because we have some outcomes that we would like, you know, the open communication, the free flow, sometimes you have to storm to norm, get people to buy in, all that kind of stuff. Those are all things that we want. I think someone talked about board and staff training. Yeah, we want all those things. I'm not sure if it exists, if our way through that is necessarily through policy. You know, there's some things I saw that you guys are scheduled to meet in the schools and being accessible, being open, looking to hear these things is some of it that I'm not sure if we can tease out in the black ink on the white paper for policy.
The thing is though, Brian, those meetings when we meet in the schools, we walk through as a board and it's set up and the teacher has this neat little presentation and the principal is there. So it's still not unofficial. It doesn't lend itself to a group of staff saying, gee, we got an issue here or bringing it forward. It's still not conducive to that, what I think we're trying to get at.
So I think we have a lot of opinions on this. I don't know if we're going to solve them all tonight, so I'm looking to wrap up discussion on this with a decision of what our next step is. But a thought here is we are asking for things that could all be interpreted as very positive outcomes with the discussion we're having now. Right, we're looking for more opportunities, better flow of information, more harmony, I guess, in understanding people's needs. And what I've witnessed in my time as a board member is that the more that we have high expectations and we work together and we communicate in our official means, it seems like the less we need to address problematic situations. Right? I don't have a good concept of grievance because we've never seen one at our local board. Why? Is it because the administration is taking care of things? It's a small school, maybe the fact that the teachers see board members there all the time. They don't necessarily talk to us, but they see us as a part of their school. Maybe they notice that we are observers. And there's so many components here I don't I don't think can be codified to establish the trust needed to get to these outcomes we're talking about. It's,
So
yeah.
And pardon my false knowledge. I don't want it to turn into ignorance, though, so I'm trying to educate myself here. But when you mention trust, I think back to Volmer, you know, and before that needs to become understanding. Understanding leads to trust, leads to permission, leads to support. And I keep hearing understanding and clarity around how can employees approach a board? And it seems like they can do that in a meeting. There's visitors to be heard. So is this really, to get to, I think you hit the nail on the head, trust. And this is my first exposure to this conversation. It really seems this is about trust of staff and taxpayers, and having the confidence that the administration, which is principals and superintendents, are doing their job. Do they have trust in those people? So I think it's coming down to understanding right now. Do we understand? Does the faculty understand? Gosh, we know how many times do we bang our heads on we didn't communicate enough. We didn't dipstick the level of understanding in the community. That's just my 2 cents, that we focus on understanding.
Thank you. So, I don't expect that we have the support for a full first reading here. Is that accurate? Thumbs up, thumbs down?
It's accurate.
With that being the case,
Are
Brian.
we giving a thumbs up?
So I'm gonna ask folks here just to indicate thumbs up, thumbs down. Do you want to see a motion for first reading indicate by?
Can we clarify the process actually? What happens after first reading? It goes to the local boards, and then it goes back to the policy committee?
No, back to
Back to here?
Here.
But can be editing in this process?
There is a possibility, or there's 2 possibilities tonight. Accept the proposed edits and deletions from the policy subcommittee. Modify those between now and second reading, make the edits I think Martha was suggesting, or flat out reject any changes to the policy at first reading. Really, three different possibilities.
And the modification can occur with the motion?
You can modify it at this very moment, and it would come back to you at second reading with the changes you proposed tonight. It would not go back to the policy subcommittee.
Is that helpful, Ryan?
Yeah. But if we decided to not, the implication is not accepting it or modifying it and accepting something is that it stops.
No,
If we go back and keep working on it?
if you accepted it all as is,
Yeah.
it would go to second reading, just like you saw tonight.
Right.
You can make proposed changes to it tonight and edits, and pass it at first reading. Those edits would also go on for the second reading.
But if we were not to pass it at all, what would happen to it?
B20 would remain as it is on the policy books right now. There would not be a change.
Right.
You could make a slight you could accept everything on here. You could accept one change on here. It's really that's the reason for the first and the second reading. There's time to change between the first and second to make those edits at a public meeting.
So to Brian's point, I think that was what I was getting at when I was saying we're trying to make it narrow. We're not trying to describe every instance in this policy of what might come up, might not come up. We're trying to explain a specific procedure for specific official communications that may or may not include the chair of the board. I would be fine eliminating the chair from that process, but making significant enough changes to the policy where it provides, it no longer, or it narrows it sufficiently to provide that openness. Some ambiguity. I actually think some ambiguity on the outskirts is fine, but that core official communication is defined specifically, and then everything else we're open to in talking.
Okay, a comment and then we'll.
No, well, I was actually going to suggest, make a motion that we take the board chair out of the recipient, as a recipient of official communication, and that in the unofficial communications section, and I don't know exactly how to word it, that we refer to the code of ethics. You know, that in
Under
the
non-official?
unofficial, right? That board members should keep the code of ethics in mind as they have these interactions. I don't know. I can't write legalese.
Yeah, there might be an opportunity to have that actually in the very first sentence where it says the policy of the CCSU is to encourage the school board interactions with school personnel, you know, in keeping with the
Oh.
VSBA Code of Ethics.
That's
while,
great.
While respecting appropriate authority and establish reporting relationships, you know, so that we embed that. And that's just, I mean, I think the big part of that is we're an all for one for all kind of movement. We don't want individual reconnaissance because it doesn't inform the will
Right.
of the group.
Right.
Individual reconnaissance, I love that. Okay, so what I heard was strike and or the board chair,
Including it.
and then
Interaction.
and include interactions with school personnel in keeping with the VSBA Code of Conduct or Code of Ethics.
Yep,
Was that a motion?
that's a motion.
Okay, that's a motion.
I'll second.
In a second. Okay, discussion.
Perfect.
So I
seen this.
I like
that.
this.
Yeah, right.
I like what you've done. Policy work is good. I love the fact that there's a crisp definition. I see the validity of removing the board chair portion. That can be addressed the next time B20 comes up if we feel this isn't working. That's my comment. Okay, no more discussion. All those in favor of accepting the first reading with Martha's proposed changes, signify by raising your hand. Okay, opposed? All right, did you catch that, Ben? It was all of us.
Let's
Thank
hope
you for your
let's
work.
hope the rest are not as hard.
Well, I think the
work.
most, thank you.
Really good work.
The most enlightening part of this is the fact that you're telling us this is the most direction you've heard. It
Yeah,
really
right.
speaks to the fact that we as local boards and chairs didn't do our jobs in soliciting that feedback in a way that seeds the committee with a chance for success. And I'm sorry for that. We can learn to do better.
And I would just add, I think it sends a strong message throughout the organization that the policy subcommittee spent this amount of time trying to find some clarity with B20, and that you're seeing it again, and that you revised it to provide more clarity. So I think it will be embraced as an opportunity to see the desire for there to be more openness and transparency, and I think that'll mean a lot.
What I like is we get to see it for a second reading
Mhm.
in writing again, so that if I've still got concerns, I have another attempt at it. But I think it was a great job. I love that unofficial, official. I really like that.
Great work.
Good job, guys. All right, your next follow.
Okay, in the interest of
This
time,
one's pretty easy, I think.
the next few, I'll just say if there are any questions on employment practices, GAD, the real reason is outlined in the cover sheet. Handling the situation when an employee voluntarily separates from employment to identify that those tuition reimbursement professional funds are prorated.
That was good.
You need a motion to approve the policy G8D.
Yes, we do.
Second.
Okay, so Marla made the motion, Martha seconded. Discussion. Are there, I mean, it seems to me prorating with termination is a fairly standard practice. Are there other places where this should be looked at that's just determined? Any discussion? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor of accepting the first reading of GAD, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay.
The next policy we're reviewing is we modified and we're recoding the relations of home study programs just to reflect, to maintain currency with updated laws and to really, it has been revised in years, so it really identifies procedures and the direction and guidance from the agency education, what's the appropriate level of services. And that can be, traditionally, it's been modified, so just keeping up with the regulations, and now we have it as a procedure rather than as a policy. Those guidance.
I move that we approve policy J8.
Second.
So, motion by Marla, second by Ryan. Any discussion? Just a quick question, saying that this hasn't, we're trying to catch up in some ways. Are there state laws that we were out of compliance with?
Not out of compliance. The policy was referring to procedures that were outdated. They were referring to agency. State Board of Education rules had changed. The state law had remained the same. So we are not outdated in terms of the policy. It still provides for access to home students. So it was pointing to procedures that were outdated. Okay.
Any other questions? Jack?
So, as I understand the conversation, I'm looking what's in the package, we are putting policy J8 in place and LPD goes away? Is that? Okay, thank you.
Okay, seeing no more questions. Those in favor of accepting the first reading of policy J8 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, J8 is in.
The final policy in front of you is a new policy, the student health policy, coded at J9. That is it's an overarching policy that will now have procedures attached to it that were existing policies. So if you look at the list of the cover sheet, this health policy now is an overarching statement that will follow the student health practices guides from the agency as well as the Department of Health. That is a comprehensive list within that guide. Nurses are mandated to follow it. Our schools are mandated to follow it. It's updated almost annually with different best practices. So our policies can't really keep up with that. So now those will be procedures. The list that you see here are the ones that are already have been worked on by the nurses to be formulated into a new procedure. So communicable disease will be a procedure, bloodborne pathogens, all these will be removed and now established procedures, which can be easily modified to be updated to the law. So it will be an overarching student health policy, and the rest of the policies below that will be removed, and now there'll be new procedures in place for concussions, life-threatening allergies, physical exams, medical administration. I imagine there'll be a few more coming for procedures. School nurses, and school health teams are working on procedures. But it's their recommendation to have these as procedures rather than our archaic policies that are really hard to change as the practices change.
I move that we approve policy J9.
Second.
Okay. Motion by Marla, seconded by Martha. Discussion?
I like the direction we're going with less policies, make them condense. I mean, sometimes we go overboard in policies.
This is actually a direction, I attended a workshop at the National School Board Conference, and this is a direction that many school boards are taking, and it's being recommended for the precise reason of reaction time. A crushing number of policies that are never referenced and can't easily be changed versus a very easy to understand policy with procedures that can react month by month if need be to changing situations. It really serves to focus the work of our policy committee. So I'm happy to see this as well. Thank you for the.
So I just want to know if anybody looking at our old policy about lice was sitting there scratching their head.
Yes.
That was hard to read,
Oh
actually.
gosh, it was hard to read.
I tell my kids not to wear someone else's hat.
As we move this way, it will be interesting for us to continue to try to test our comfort and feel, because procedures are administrative control,
Right.
but we're putting more there,
Yeah.
which makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm for it. As we go, it's another one of those delicate balances where we've been able to create something that very few supervisory unions have, and as things go down into procedure, they can just start to get a little bit further away from us. So we'll want to try to figure out some way that we're having, I don't know, I almost think of a policy governance thing, some kind of accountability report or something, some way to sort of say, how are we doing on this policy? And then need to have some way to report out on how we're doing on the procedures.
Judy decided, and actually we decided that traditionally we don't need to put the procedures up for first reading, but I think in terms of transparency and making sure that it's consistent with policy subcommittee agreed, that to make sure it's consistent with the direction of that policy and the spirit of the policy, that those procedures should at least come up for first reading along with the policy that they're under.
So it might actually be as simple as every time a procedure is changed, there's either a note in the next org notes or there's a bulletin that's sent out to all board members. Rather than trying to remember to discuss it on an annual basis, maybe just some practice that keeps board members informed would make sense.
I also suspect the policy committee, as you're getting going with policy and you're reviewing the sections, that if it gets done in a timely manner, that I'm assuming the policy committee is looking at the procedures at the same time they're updating policies.
But the procedures aren't generated by the policy committee.
Correct,
Right,
but
so
I'm
that
assuming they're
linkage is
looking
what's-
at them.
But what I hear is that procedures are going to be, we probably won't go back to the student, sorry Mark, I didn't raise my hand. We probably won't go back to the student section of the policy manual for a few years. And the procedures are going to be updated in the meantime. So, anyway.
And I would just add that as we're creating this new data system, I think it'll be important for us to look at what are some of these procedures that we could collect data on. Like, how do we know the health and wellness of the students within our SU? You know, what's the data on our concussions, and what are the sports where those are happening most? And so our new system is aligned with SNAP, which is where we're collecting their health data now. So that would be part of what is it that the board would like to know on an annual basis that gives you that assurance that those procedures are informing
Right.
you as far as what your resource allocation needs are, the needs of our
Right.
students are.
I think I just also throw out maybe for Paul's advocacy for ours is maybe working with communications and policy subcommittee, the way we deliver policies to our constituency as we start to get all these procedures. I mean, we are getting a better alphanumerical or alpha system. It's hard, it's hard to see kind of quickly whether something's changed. There's no date of last revision on it. Sometimes the titles are a little bit vague, the title of the policy. It's a little clunky the way that we deliver our policies, and I think the way we deliver it is great that we're so transparent, but now as we have all these procedures, we might want to be trying to figure out whether there's a tool within our website or some other tool or build out that can make it a little bit more accessible for us, because
I wholeheartedly support that, and I think we talked about that at the last meeting, what we could do in terms of bringing visibility and a better search engine into the policy and procedures.
yeah.
One thing for sure, I was thinking of it as we were talking, is the use of our CCSU Weekly, at least for our faculties and staff, to see these are the policies that went through the first reading, the intent, the transparency, or maybe even just the cover page,
Yeah.
and then the link to that revision. So at least internally, we'll have added clarity.
Okay. Any
Did
other
we officially
comments?
vote yet?
No, we were about to.
Oh, okay.
So, all those in favor of policy J9 first reading signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Unanimous once again. Okay. So I'd like to make a motion to remove the following policies, existing policies that are covered by the changed procedures. They are as follows: policy JHCC, JHCC-R, JHCE, JHCD, JHCB. Are you caught up?
Do you have them
Do you have
already?
them? Yeah.
No.
There we go. And JHF. I feel like I just read an eye cherry.
Bingo.
So
I'll second the motion.
Thanks. Any discussion? Okay, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes.
Our valuable lawyer here is worthwhile keeping.
Absolutely. It's refreshing to see so many good
Yes.
things come by our eyes.
Yes.
All right, Paul, thank you. You're excused.
Time to move on to B21.
Thank you.
Yes.
Another piece of.
Really, the leadership for the
Staff.
policy committee through Paul's guidance has been commendable, so I'm glad you were here tonight to.
It's been a great committee, and I just want to say thanks to Ryan for
Thanks, and Carol.
Wow.
Is this our last meeting with Ryan?
Yes, it is.
Whoa,
Oh.
you're not running it
So,
now. At least not for the school board? Huh?
So that's not an agenda item.
agenda item number 6, annual work plan. So, in your org notes, you see what the existing 2013-2014 AWP looked like. It's organized in a fashion that's pretty straightforward, not a lot of information beyond the topics. Now, the way that this was initially presented, there was an expectation that we would flesh out the milestones or deliverables, or perhaps the expected outcomes for each of these. But Judy had provided this as kind of an entry plan to the superintendency last year, and I think we've all started to appreciate that simplicity can sometimes be very helpful. in some cases, I think during the formative assessment, we identified that perhaps it would have been helpful to understand where in the process we would expect to be, and what a binary, accomplished or not accomplished may look like. But being able to reference this in all of our work has been at least helpful for me. So now we're looking at what the AWP for 2014-2015 should look like. And the conversations that have occurred at the executive committee level have very much shown us that this needs to be inclusive of our board's goals that we've collected, as well as the superintendent's feedback on those goals. Perhaps sometimes dealing with priority or order of operations, which ones need to happen before I can accomplish the others, or priority in relation to pressing issues, so compliance with the state law, or something similar that we've seen in the last year or so. So the conversation that we're going to have tonight, I think I want to lead off with kind of Judy's take. You call this a chicken and egg problem, and I agree in some ways, but I'd like you to kind of start with the way that this has served you well and where it hasn't, and some thoughts as we craft this next year's.
So, under policy, well, let me start by just saying, I see this work plan posted all over the offices. So it was a way to bring everybody into a focus as far as what the priorities were. And Mark and I looked at some different different work plans and different supervisory unions, and we kept coming back to the simplicity of a one-page work plan, and how it served me well right out of the gate was my ability to communicate the priorities and the goals of the district moving forward, that I was able to communicate through convocation in the very beginning, and for the organization to see that the work happens in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's the work of teachers under the curriculum instruction and assessment piece, but at least they can find their place in the work plan, and I think it grounded board members in their work as well. So just briefly, under policy, we all know that the Act 153 procedure was stalled due to the need to still acquire the criteria for waiver process, which was the direction we were headed in. And to date, we've still not received that criteria.
And if I may interject, if you look at the governance bill, I think you'll see that they take out the ability to get waiver. Now, that may not pass for a while, but
That's another added piece to the changing sands of different legislation.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Good luck with your work this week.
Ben, just note that Martha left the
Left
meeting.
at 8:30. But another way to connect that work moving forward was our work with a unified agreement, because if and when we bring another bargaining unit into play as far as our special educators are concerned, at least we'll have unified all of the conditions around that. So it was a step. We took a step. To use sort of Jack's insights when I met with the executive committee, what's inherent in this is the critical need for clarity as far as if you're going to evaluate someone and you see Act 153 procedure and then it doesn't happen, making very sure that what is the clarity of expectation around that?
Right.
And did I sum
No,
up well?
You're doing wonderfully.
That we're clear that if we need to move in this direction and it's dependent upon criteria, that we start to identify upon receipt of criteria, absent receipt of criteria, so that we know why a goal is attained or not. Under wellness, the policy task team has worked on a very thin wellness policy. And it's incumbent upon the superintendent to write a procedure to actualize the intent and spirit of the policy. So that's in play. But as you saw tonight, you saw an overarching student health policy that really came forward first as far as addressing some of those procedural pieces. So I think at some moments in time we were changing some of our overarching structures, but I was very narrow in my focus of just saying we need to have a wellness policy updated. And then with much regret, our contracted service wellness coordinator, Gabrielle Smith, has recently resigned that position. So that's a, movement backwards and having to think about another way to accomplish that. So when there's things that start to put a cog in the wheel, how do we overcome that but still move forward with the direction? I think that's really important to attain that ultimate goal. And it was a chance to say that under Gabrielle's direction, in trying to move forward, it was with deeper appreciation that I realized all that she did, and it's with really heartfelt thanks for her service. Under negotiations, I just identified, we were going to negotiate this year. Had no idea in May when I wrote that it would become a unified agreement and what entailed that. So what was entailed through that process. So again, the clarity of it and the clarity of it moving forward. And how do we craft those statements in a way that they're can be used to evaluate the superintendent, but also as board goals, so you have your sense of accomplishment that we've attained that which you've prioritized and what is being prioritized. The health exchange is a big piece of a learning curve, and there's a lot of unknowns in that process right now. So part of what Mark said is what worked well for you and where are some areas you'd improve. I would put maybe less on this, but flesh out the direction or priorities that you identify moving forward. Communications, I think our communications task team really did use communication strategic plan in moving forward, and Calendar 2.0 was one example of a communications, but that rested in a whole nother organization, which was the Champlain Valley Superintendents Association, to actualize that goal. So that was solely an example of how will we communicate that versus we will acquire Calendar 2.0 this current year, and the clarity that Jack reminds us of. I think in the area of board visioning, the board excelled in board member training and orientation through their board site, and also all moving to the same CCSU account and cleaning up our communication so that it's not being managed through email any longer. And the work of two boards around appreciative inquiry. People have stayed focused on that work, and I've been included in that, and it's been appreciated. And of course, you achieved with distinction on your superintendent search process this year.
I'm
But-
wondering why that was your priority.
But there was a lot I've learned through that process too. Some of the feedback, and Mark and I have talked about this, and Michael as well, and Jack, about some of the feedback about how we were structured this year and how will we be structured moving forward, and using that feedback, you know, as we think about the associate's position, for example, next year, and the communication I've received to date on that. And so that needs further attention, but to use that process is another way to inform the organization moving forward. Both the leadership pieces reach capacity issues quickly, as far as teachers feeling that their current S&E is working fine, and that they didn't have the time at this moment to really research the different models and changes that are being suggested at this point in time this year, because of the avalanche of implementation of Common Core and new assessments and a new data system and an assessment plan. So in this particular area, I think I'll lean more on ELT to make a recommendation moving forward around our capacity of what would be front and center stage moving forward. I did this in May without with tracking some of that work, but without asking them for a formalization of a goal. And the same is true of CIA. It's all of that is happening right now under curriculum instruction and assessment in one form or another. And that's the meat and potatoes of what we do, and what's the board's relationship with that, and what's the communication with that. Under equity, that piece continues to evolve. And under climate, your survey is in play right now, actually, for the next this is the second week. We encourage participation at the parent level and faculty and staff level and student levels. And finally, under support and safety endeavors, this is paramount in what I wrote in all of my reports this year, annual reports for all of our schools. And we've talked about it in different board meetings, and especially under budget development this year, on how we continue to have safe and respectful learning environments. And I've appreciated the board's identification of resources. Every one of the boards identified additional safety resources this year in moving forward. So that's the short of where we found ourselves. And now I'm open to hearing how this plan helped inform your goals and directions as boards this year.
So other, observations from the executive committee to set the stage here would probably be appropriate. I know I don't necessarily speak for all of us, because this is a rather complex process that we're getting used to.
So, I want to, and thank you for taking us through that, Superintendent DeNova. It's very useful to, and mind you, as you said a couple times in your presentation tonight, this is a plan that you put together last May, right? Mm-hmm. So now we're sitting here 10 months after this was put together, and a couple things come into play here as we talked earlier this evening about the superintendent's evaluation process. We look at this, at least I look at this from two perspectives. One is as an instrument for using for summative evaluation coming in for next year, but then also what is it that we want to put in for those not necessarily the exact topics, but how do we structure these annual work plans for next year's annual work plan. And one of the things we had talked about in the executive committees is having these goals be, the SMART kind of goals, attainable, measurable, except forget what all the
Realistic.
how they come together. So, for example, and this may or may not be a good one, but when we say negotiations, teacher and support staff, a goal that I would like to have seen, and I'm not saying this is the right goal, but something that's smart, is to say something like, by the 30th of June in 2014, we have a unified contract that's been approved by both the association and the school districts, okay? That's unambiguous, it's measurable, it's attainable, okay? And so those kinds of further clarifications, as we've talked about here, for these elements, need to be defined as we go forward with future annual work plans.
Yep. Michael, if you want to think for a sec, I'll add one bit to what Jack was talking about. And there are cases where we will identify goals that are a bit undefined. So it's not unrealistic for us to look at an AWP and say, research the feasibility of, or how would this be implemented if we were to go in this direction, where the work identified would actually be feedback back to help create a defined SMART goal, right? And to realize that we can expect either side of that spectrum in the work we're doing. That, I believe, really can help address these longer term and far reaching board goals that we discussed in a way that's responsible enough, where the superintendent has the leeway to try to visualize what does the future of the education center look like, and then give us the feedback we need to craft the actual goals, perhaps in the future AWP. So we don't have to lock ourselves into thinking a deliverable is only you've accomplished this. It could be deliver the research or deliver the information to help us make next step decisions.
I don't really have any extensive information to really add to what Jack and Mark have already said, but to keep in mind that the goals we want to establish, that we do keep it to a very limited number, that it's not this large volume of goals, that and that they keep in mind the CCSU vision statement, I think is important, that we keep that in mind with the goals.
Yeah, a long list of goals makes us feel good
Right.
when we make them, but not necessarily when we review them.
Right. It makes it much more difficult to measure those goals because there's so many.
I think we're, this is tremendous progress from, as we're going forward. This is great progress introducing the work plan and so forth. It still is, without the board, without the organization doing some heavy lifting, it's still very much a radar report. This was what was visible at the time. Judy found there were a few things that were not visible at the time, and a few of them were just the tops of icebergs that ended up being a lot bigger than they looked in May. So we've got a radar report, and part of that is because, the organization, the board, hasn't set, a vision of what do we want to be. If that's what we want to be, then we need to employ these strategies, and then we need to, this is sort of a list of action steps for the year. But it would be interesting to have much broader set of goals kind of this is all vocabulary, kind of however you want to organize your kind of planning, but broader things so that as things come up, that Judy's able to put those into context of points of emphasis or goals of the organization. Is, you know, we didn't see this coming up out of the legislature in January when we decided to do this in May of last year. Should we be doing it? Well, it fits this goal, you know, it fits this goal, or it's part of this strategy. So we need to do it, but capacity is an issue.
Yeah.
So what don't we need to be doing? You know? So it, you know, I think this is great progress, and I think that little steps are fine, but I think every now and then we should kind of stretch our neck and realize probably as we go, some of the work is gonna come in not identifying what's on the radar for the next year, but actually, like, where do we ultimately want to be? Strategic planning kind of process.
To Brian's point, part of the language that we use in this, we call this an annual work plan, okay? Kind of sets our horizon 12 months away, right? And some of these strategic initiatives have a much longer horizon than that. So we have to think strategically in this, in putting our plans together, that there may be things, or there are incremental steps towards a more strategic vision that we tackle annually. They don't all have to be just annual goals, but never. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. I know I get hung up on annual work plan, and we look at this from a 12-month perspective, when in fact a great amount of work from our board visioning, creating a mission that we as a board in our individual districts and here at CCSU can subscribe to, that takes us into more broadened educational opportunities for our students that can't be accomplished in 12 months, you know, have to somehow be addressed.
For me, what was especially helpful was when the Leaders at Work task team reconvened, and this board decided in November that you would move forward with the superintendent's evaluation. It was the first opportunity I had to work with board members across the SU to match up what some of the work was with what the evaluation tool is, and that's those standards, and to ask the important question of, tell me what evidence you would be looking for to know that I've attained a goal. And we started to calibrate around evidence. And I think that what I received from feedback, because I was able to show evidence, was to begin to answer those questions around narrowing if there were 7 things in a particular standard as far as visioning. That team helped me focus in on the 2 that they felt was most important moving forward. Without that direction, I think I would have floundered, but it was able to give me added clarity too. And I think what was helpful in the end of my formative assessment was when we reviewed that evidence, and I got your feedback about what was helpful in that and what you wanted more of. So our beginning process of going through that evaluation, I found extremely beneficial. And what feedback is supposed to do is, you know, guide us forward in that continuous improvement mode. So I would hope, and I'd appreciated the visual that you saw that Jack drew and Ben captured on the computer about that annual work plan and how it falls into the superintendent's evaluation. That's a complex structure to keep in play, and I think the Leaders at Work task team really figured that out. And even if we can just stay focused with some integrity with the implementation of that timeline, that'll propel us forward as well, because we have a structure to check in. And I I think that's important in moving forward.
So, yeah, question?
I've got a question in that, over the summer is when the boards meet, and I know principals meet with Judy. And what I'm looking at with the superintendent evaluation timeline, when I'm looking at this, is the boards doing their action planning in the summer. Like when we get together, there's things that we as a board are going to have to do, and we're deciding it in August.
So like retreat
But the
time?
annual work plan is supposed to be done. So just bear with me, because I think we're doing things backwards. Now that I'm looking at this, I think some of the boards, what they need as goals, come into play in the annual work plan.
Absolutely.
So I suspect that, again, when we go back to Leaders at Work, I think we've got to look at this timeline when boards are actually doing their planning. I think we've got to be I'm looking at it and noticing it. The other thing I would recommend looking at this, going through this process tonight, is we talked about throwing out annual work plan ideas at board meetings, and then we had your chairs get together. I'm almost thinking that we should take it from our boards and bring it to Leaders at Work and do an initial document that then comes to CCSU instead of us trying to decide here what we're going to do, for our annual work plan. Because I think we can do it quicker and faster and bring a document, take the feedback. Because what I've heard from Mike and I've heard from Mark, I think the executive committee, what their meetings that they're having to do, I think it's overwhelming.
So
It's too much.
I'd like to kind of pick up that thread a bit. What you have identified, I think, is true. I did not intend to use tonight as a working meeting to define the AWP, but instead to kind of illuminate the process we used, and then create an awareness for why we have to pay attention to not only our expected outcomes, but then, the vision and goals when we craft this, and then try to create a workable framework that then allows us in committee, or whether it's executive or Leaders at Work, to bring this forward as an almost completed piece of work. So you were saying timing, and I agree, but I slightly disagree, right? In asking people, what are some of the AYP goals, what are some of the board goals that you may want to identify, I think that's a little bit of headlights towards what our planning days might look like, right? These are the topics of the day that are very important. Like PC is understanding there is space concern. How do we address it? That most likely will come up during your planning days. And for us to be able to kind of know a little bit ahead of time how to take these items, then go all the way to the end of this, and how identify perhaps the two sub-pieces of an evaluation model under 5 categories, where those might fit in, then come back to the middle to see how the AWP can show evidence if those are the goals, but then incorporate where the board wants to go with the realities of the superintendent's expectations for what the school year are going to look like. That's that's a bit difficult to do, but I think we can do it if we minimize the scope, if we really keep it to be something achievable. And we're not talking day-to-day duties anymore, right? Negotiations off the, if you look at how much stuff left this chart from last year, I think that's a very good indication of what doesn't need to be in here, right?
Yeah, but you're under negotiations again.
We're going to have to do it anyway. That's a part of the regular duties of a superintendent. That is not necessarily an AWP goal unless we are expecting something majorly different, or
Which it became.
it became, but that's not where it started.
That's right.
right? So to be cautious, to cross off expected duties and leave the ones that require extra work, extra attention, extra study, whatever you want to define it as, and then have those link backwards to board goals and forwards to the evaluation.
Exactly.
And suddenly at that moment it made sense to me, where we could do this in a way that's not going to consume 3 to 10 meetings every year, and still have it make sense to every individual who tacks it up to their cubicle wall. So that's kind of the proposal that I'm hoping to see, and that work is not going to happen here. It's committee work, but the critical inputs have already been provided, and now that needs to be assimilated and turned into a short document that's achievable. Perhaps a little unachievable, just to keep things interesting, right?
Right.
Because we have to approve it in May, the annual work plan.
Yes. So I'm curious about your reactions to that line of thinking. You know, finding the linkages, making it achievable, in satisfying the goals, and then making it evidence-based so that our evaluation later can be as smooth and realistic. We need to have very realistic evaluations that tell our superintendent exactly what we did not like and what we did, in language that will allow them to reflect and come back with an approach that will hopefully work better.
And just so that I understand, in an effort of continuous improvement,
In an
right?
effort of
Absolutely.
Not as a destination.
Correct.
Yeah, I agree
Absolutely.
with that.
I mean, and this is this year 2 for this particular model, and the learning from year 1 was it's very hard to make informed decisions around change if we are not focused in our evidence and critique.
Goes back to your statement, Brian, about the need for a very specific, relevant vision.
Yeah.
That's where it all.
But this,
So from that vision, you get the SMART goals, and you don't get too many of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this has the potential of doing that. That gap is not one that's been easy for us to, it hasn't been out of a lack of trying, because when you get into the CCSU level, it's tricky,
Complicated,
so it's because we're a little bit of everything, and there's this time and attention on Parks and Rec and on this and that, and so it's hard when you get to that level and that strategic planning part. But I see this as, we've got a mission statement right now, and it's been there, and I think we can spend some time working on that or looking at it, and we're developing and making more sophisticated and more mature our sort of annualized planning focuses, points of emphasis. I think that's going to give us more and more opportunity to say, oh, wait a minute, here's that middle piece, here's the broader strategy. Your point of saying that this year might be a identify goal, research, identify. Next year might be that goal becomes more of a develop, and then it becomes an executable, and then all of a sudden we start to realize we can make long range plans. We don't have to make them one a year at a time.
Right.
We can, we're asking you to identify something for a purpose, so
Right.
maybe we could look at how to stretch that out.
Yeah, it does. When we talk about planning days and the CCSU board, I know we've identified the need, but even one day to sit and plan isn't really what's going to make the difference. I think it's the ability for us to understand how to introduce long-range topics in a way that we can then evolve them into. Because the concept of first reading, second reading, things evolve the more we listen and the more we think. And we apply it several places. To apply it to the direction and the vision is a more organic way than just getting in a room for 4 hours, one day a year, saying, what's the vision now? Because that doesn't feel true. Any other thoughts here? I mean, this is going to go to committee.
Sometimes we can talk and go in circles and not come up with a work product. So where do you start? My goal is send me away from here. What do you want me to do? What do we need to do to come up with an annual work plan with goals?
So the steps, the required steps are, first of all, I think the executive committee has one more task, and that is to sit with the superintendent and identify out of the evaluation model. You know, this is again using our judgment for the next year. What are the, under each category, each of the 5 categories, what are the 1 to 2 focus areas that we will be looking for evidence for our evaluation.
Okay, so the next question is, when will you meet? So that we can be on target with this, so that we can be on target.
Well, before I get to that, just let me finish the thought.
Okay.
Right, so identify based on the evaluation model, the items, then compile all of any of the board goal work we have with the known issues coming up. So by known issues, I'm talking about Act 53, 153 waiver, right? So not a regular job description, but one that we can predict will most likely be required to be in the AWP. And then with those 2 pieces of information, we can go to leaders at work. And I'm suggesting that the executive committee join those meetings so that we have 100% transfer of thought and knowledge in that case, and then craft the AWP knowing all of those necessary conditions.
Okay, so it's got to be crafted and brought back to this committee by May 24th, is it? What's the date in May?
For the May board meeting?
It's towards the end of May.
And leaders at work have a meeting in April
17th.
17th. So before April 17th,
We can do that.
then executive committee has to be at that meeting and bring forward those items.
Yes.
Okay.
So we start with the measurements essentially. Add the requirements of things that will take time. And then we know what opportunity we have for the longer term, the strategic and the priority goals that are not already covered by those. Hopefully that gets us to contain and constrain the list. Okay. So thoughts and questions on this before we take it back through committees? I mean, this does feel long-winded, but it's taken a long time for all of us to really understand how we can do this and not have it be a total mess every time and a restart every time. There's so many good intentions here, but we gotta figure out how to execute it.
And the
Alright.
problem is if we can't, then go back to the drawing board and
Yeah.
figure out what we can accomplish. It's just not fair not to be able to do an evaluation for a superintendent yearly.
Well,
If
we don't
we've
need
got,
to-
if we've got such a complex process that we get bogged down and we can't meet the deadlines, then something's wrong.
we're still in the learning year, right? This is just year 2 of a new model.
Year 2,
Right,
My
so-
history of sitting
But
on-
not the same superintendent,
But
right?
my,
So
my
that's
history of
the
sitting
difference.
on leaders at work, every time I've been on it since Mike's tenure here. Every time we've had an obstacle come up, we've been able to negotiate it relatively easily, relative being a key word there. We've moved forward. We haven't become overwhelmed. The discussion has been very targeted and specific and relevant. So there's a history there of being efficient and effective with our energy and our time. So I'm confident that we won't right now get bogged down.
All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to this. From this, we will have executive committee meeting scheduled in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll be there to join you on Leaders at Work, which may take somebody may have to not be there for that one if we have quorums, accidental quorums for local boards. So just a heads up, we'll have to make sure we think about that properly.
Yeah. Martha probably has legislature stuff, so Scott and you.
That's fine. It's just we have to think about that
be aware.
to do it correctly. All right, so we move on to number 7, the consent agenda, which includes approved warrants, approved meeting minutes from January 27th, 2014, approved use of funds, approved extension of transportation contracts, contract non-renewals, and issuance of contracts.
I have.
Is there anything that needs to come off the consent agenda?
I just have additional information as far as your non-renewals coming along.
Okay.
It's one of each. And these were determined during your budget process.
So these non-renewals were ones that we understood since September
Yes,
and are expecting.
yes. And I have your contracts to be signed after you approve issuance.
Okay, so consent agenda, do I have a motion?
So moved. Move to approve the consent agenda.
Okay.
We're missing a copy.
You can have mine. Extra one. Okay, so we have a motion. I'll second it. And all those in favor of approving the consent agenda as is, signify by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, thank you, folks. Future agenda items, topic number 8. So our upcoming meeting will be devoted to AWP
Reorganization.
Thank you. We will have the
Budget
PC
approval.
and PC and 46 boards there. So reorg, budget approval, the final SU budget approval. AWP, anything else for that or
Is that the
future
reading?
meetings?
There'll be second reading, policy second reading.
What else comes up in May? All the boards have reorged by then.
Yep.
We have calendar.
Calendar be local.
So do you want to mention this stuff?
Yeah, when do we want to talk about the calendar and some of the things
Reorg.
we found?
Reorganization, but if you have recommendations, sending those to my attention, I can,
Just send it to your
Revise.
attention if I've
Okay.
seen some mistakes.
absolutely.
Okay, so reorg, budget approval, AWP, and second reading of policies. That's a
That's a
pretty good
big-
agenda already.
Yeah.
So if you have any other future agenda items, feel free to send them towards me, and we can incorporate them as we see fit. So, seeing nothing else, I would like to, I move we adjourn our meeting at 9:09.
All right.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Good job.